I never thought I'd see the day when my husband of 12 years would look me in the eyes and tell me he was leaving. Not just leaving me, but leaving our children too. Yet there I was, standing in our kitchen on a Tuesday evening, the pasta. Water boiling over on the stove as Mark calmly explained that he'd found happiness elsewhere and would be moving out by the weekend. "What about Zoe and Tyler?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as the steam clouded between us. He glanced toward the living room where our children were watching TV, oblivious to the fact that their world was about to shatter. "I'll see them when I can, of course," he said, as if discussing a casual arrangement with distant relatives. "But Vanessa and I need time to build our life together." Vanessa. The name hit me like a physical blow. His assistant at Caldwell Financial. The woman he'd assured me was just a colleague when I'd noticed the late-night texts. Now suddenly she was important enough to abandon his family for. "And her kids?" I managed to ask, gripping the counter to stay upright. Mark's eyes brightened, in a way they hadn't for our children in months. "Olivia and Jake are great, smart kids. They're at Westlake Academy." Westlake Academy, the private school that cost more per semester than my entire annual salary as a part-time graphic designer. The school we'd decided was too expensive when discussing Zoe's education just last year. That was 3 months ago. Since then, my life had transformed into something I didn't recognize. Single motherhood, weekend custody exchanges where Zoe cried and Tyler asked why Daddy didn't want to live with us anymore. Child support checks that barely covered groceries, let alone the mortgage on the house Mark had insisted we buy. But it was at Zoe's soccer game last weekend when everything changed again. When I discovered exactly who was funding those private school tuitions for Mark's shiny new family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Part 1. The Wake-Up Call. The morning started like any other, since Mark left. The chaotic rush of getting 2 children fed, dressed, and out the door while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. I was pouring cereal for Tyler when Zoe appeared in the kitchen doorway, clutching a wrinkled form. "Mom, you forgot to sign my permission slip," she said quietly. "It's for the science museum trip. It's due today." I wiped my hands on a dish, towel, and reached for the paper. "Sorry, sweetie. Things have been crazy." "Dad would have remembered," she muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. The words stung, but I swallowed my hurt. "Let's get that signed," I said instead, searching for a pen among the pile of bills on the counter, bills that kept growing while my income remained painfully inadequate. "When's Dad picking us up this weekend?" Tyler asked, milk dribbling down his chin. "Friday after school," I replied, the same answer I gave every week. The custody agreement was the one thing Mark managed to keep consistent, every other weekend and Wednesday dinners. Just enough to play the role of father without the actual responsibility. After dropping the kids at school, I headed to the coffee shop where I'd arranged to meet Maya. She was waiting at our usual table, 2 lattes already waiting. "You look exhausted," she said by way of greeting. I slumped into the chair opposite. "Her." "Thanks." Just what every woman wants to hear. Maya reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Have you talked to your lawyer about increasing the child support?" I shook my head. "Mark says he's already paying what the court ordered. Says he's stretched thin with the new house and everything." "The new house in Ridgewood Estates?" Maya raised an eyebrow. "The one that costs 3 times what your mortgage does? While you're picking up extra freelance jobs just to keep the lights on?" I stirred my coffee absently. "He says Vanessa contributes." Maya scoffed. "Vanessa, who was a receptionist until last year? That Vanessa?" I shrugged. I didn't want to think about Vanessa, with her perfect hair and her perfect house and her perfect children, who now had more of my husband's attention than my own kids did. "Did I tell you they're all going to Aspen for Christmas?" I said, the bitterness seeping into my voice despite my best efforts. Meanwhile, I had to tell Zoe we couldn't afford the dance classes she's been taking since she was 4. Maya's expression darkened. That's not right, Becca. Mark has responsibilities to his children, his first children. Try telling him that. I glanced at my watch. I should go. I've got a client meeting in half an hour. Maya stood with, just promise me you'll talk to the lawyer. Something doesn't add up with Mark's sudden wealth. I will, I lied. The truth was, I was too tired to fight. Too afraid of making things worse for the kids if I pushed back too hard. The rest of the week passed in a blur of work deadlines, homework supervision, and trying not to cry where the children could see me. By Friday afternoon, I was standing in the school pickup line, watching as other mothers chatted in groups, their lives seemingly unmarked by the kind of upheaval that had become my daily reality. I spotted Zoe emerging from the building, her expression brightening momentarily before falling again when she saw me. I thought Dad was picking us up, she said as she approached. He'll pick you up from our house, I explained gently. Remember? We talked about this at breakfast. She nodded, but I could see the disappointment. It cut deep, knowing that in her eyes, time with her father had become the highlight of her week, while I had become the background, the default, the one who was always there but never exciting enough. Tyler bounded up behind her, his backpack. Nearly as big as he was. Mom, I got a gold star in math today. I knelt down to his level, grateful for his enthusiasm. That's amazing, buddy. I'm so proud of you. The drive home was filled with Tyler's chatter about his day, while Zoe stared silently out the window. I tried not to take it personally. The therapist I'd started taking them to, another expense Mark complained about, had explained that children often misdirect their anger about divorce toward the parent who's most present. When we pulled into the driveway, Mark's new BMW was already parked at the curb. My stomach tightened instinctively. These exchanges never got easier. He was leaning against his car, scrolling through his phone. He looked good, better than when we were married. New haircut, designer clothes, an expensive watch I'd never seen before. Success looked good on him. Abandonment had been kind to Mark Wilson. "Dad!" Tyler shouted, fumbling with his seatbelt before I'd even turned off the engine. Mark looked up and smiled, the genuine kind of smile I hadn't seen directed at me in the final years of our marriage. "There's my little man." Zoe was more restrained but equally eager, walking quickly to receive her hug. I hung back by my car, the familiar feeling of being an outsider in what used to be my own family washing over me. Mark nodded in my direction. "Rebecca." "Mark." My voice was clipped but civil. "They've both got homework this weekend. Zoe has a math test on Monday she needs to study for." He waved dismissively. "We'll handle it. I've got tickets to the aquarium tomorrow, though, so we might be busy." The aquarium, another luxury I couldn't afford to give them. Another way Mark could be the fun parent while I enforced homework and bedtimes and vegetable consumption. "They need to be back by 6 on Sunday," I reminded him. "It's a school night." "I know the arrangement, Rebecca." His tone was cool. "I don't need reminders." I bit my tongue to keep from pointing out the 3 times in the past 2 months he'd brought them back late with no apology. Instead, I turned to the kids. "Have a great weekend. I love you both." Tyler hugged me quickly. Zoe offered a perfunctory, "Bye, Mom," before following her father to his car. I watched them drive away, then went inside to an empty house that felt too big and too quiet without them. I allowed myself exactly 10 minutes to cry before moving to my home office. I had a deadline for a branding project, and with the kids gone, I could work uninterrupted. Hours later, my phone buzzed with a text. I expected it to be from Mark, possibly canceling the weekend as he occasionally did when something better came up. Instead, it was from Eleanor, my former mother-in-law. "Having dinner at Riverside Grill tomorrow night. Would love to see you. If you're free. I stared at the message in surprise. Eleanor and Harold had remained cordial after the divorce, but social invitations were rare. Usually they saw the kids during Mark's time, another source of pain as I imagined my children enjoying family gatherings I was no longer welcome at. I hesitated before typing back. The kids are with Mark this weekend. Her response came quickly. I know. I'd like to see you. Curiosity won out over the desire to spend my child-free weekend in pajamas with wine and Netflix. What time? Saturday evening found me at Riverside Grill, overdressed and anxious. I'd changed outfits 3 times, eventually settling on a simple black dress I'd had since before the divorce. Eleanor had always been impeccably styled, and even now I felt the old desire to impress her. She was already seated when I arrived, elegant as ever in a silk blouse, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. She stood to embrace me, something she'd rarely done even when Mark and I were married. "Rebecca, you look lovely," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "Thank you for inviting me." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I replied, uncertain of the protocol for dining with your ex-husband's mother. "Is Harold joining us?" A shadow crossed her face. "No, he's with Mark and the children tonight." "Oh." I unfolded my napkin, feeling awkward. "I didn't realize." Eleanor sighed heavily. "That's part of why I wanted to see you, Rebecca. There are things happening that I don't agree with, and I thought you should know." A server appeared to take our drink orders, momentarily halting the conversation. Once he departed, Eleanor leaned forward, her voice lowered. "I assume you know about Mark and Vanessa's new house? The private school for her children?" I nodded stiffly. "He mentions it often enough." "And has he explained how he's affording it all?" she asked, her eyes intent on mine. The question caught me off guard. I assumed he got a promotion, or Vanessa makes more than I thought. Eleanor's laugh was brittle. "Vanessa doesn't contribute a dime, and yes, Mark received a small promotion, but nothing that would support the lifestyle they're flaunting." My stomach tightened with a mix of curiosity and dread. "Then how?" "Harold," she said simply. "My husband is funding their entire charade." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Harold Thompson, the man who had lectured me about financial responsibility when Mark and I were struggling with our mortgage. The man who had refused to help us pay for Zoe's speech therapy when she was younger because he believed in standing on your own 2 feet. "I don't understand," I managed to say as the server returned with our drinks. Eleanor took a long sip of her wine before continuing. "Harold always favored Mark above our other children. But this is beyond favoritism. He's paying the tuition for Vanessa's children. He helped with the down payment on that ridiculous house. He even financed their trip to Europe last summer." "Europe?" I echoed faintly, remembering how Mark had claimed he couldn't afford to contribute to the children's summer camp fees that same year. $20,000 at least, Eleanor confirmed. Meanwhile, Harold refused when I suggested helping, with Zoe and Tyler's education fund. My fingers tightened around my water glass. "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor's expression softened with something like regret. "Because it's wrong, Rebecca. I've watched you struggle to provide for those children while my husband enables Mark to play happy family with his new wife and her kids. I've stayed silent too long because I didn't want to come between my husband and son, but..." She shook her head. "When I heard Zoe had to quit her dance classes, something broke in me." "How did you know about that?" "She told me last time she visited. She was trying not to cry." Eleanor reached across the table and grasped my hand. "Those are my grandchildren, too, my first grandchildren, and they're being treated like an afterthought." I swallowed hard against the lump forming in my throat. "What do you expect me to do with this information, Eleanor?" "I don't know. she admitted. But I thought you deserved to know the truth, and… She hesitated. I have something else to tell you. Harold set up trust funds for Vanessa's children. Substantial ones. Zoe and Tyler have nothing comparable. The injustice of it stole my breath. My children, Mark's flesh and blood, were being denied opportunities while their father paraded around town with his replacement family, all bankrolled by the grandparents who'd claimed financial boundaries when it came to helping us. Does Mark know you're telling me this? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Eleanor shook her head. No, and he'd be furious if he found out. But I'm tired of the secrets, Rebecca. I'm tired of watching my grandchildren get less than they deserve. By the time dinner ended, my mind was racing with this new information. Eleanor hugged me goodbye in the parking lot, pressing a thick envelope into my hands. Bank statements, she whispered. Proof of everything I've told you. I made copies from Harold's files. I stared at her, stunned by this act of rebellion, from a woman who'd always seemed the model of propriety and loyalty. Eleanor, why now? After all this time? She looked suddenly older, the restaurant's lights highlighting the lines of worry on her face. Because family should mean something, Rebecca. And what Mark and my husband are doing, that's not family. That's not love. I drove home in a daze, the envelope burning a hole in my purse. Once inside, I spread the documents across my kitchen table, the very table where Mark had informed me he was leaving. The evidence was undeniable. Tuition payments for Olivia and Jake, a $75,000 gift toward the down payment on the Ridgewood Estates house. Monthly transfers to Mark's account labeled simply as family support that dwarfed the child support he reluctantly paid me. No wonder he could afford Aspen for Christmas. No wonder Vanessa drove a new Range Rover while I had to beg for help when my 10-year-old Honda needed repairs. I gathered the papers with trembling hands, emotions warring within me. Anger at Mark and Harold, gratitude toward Eleanor. And underneath it all, a growing resolve. This wasn't just about money. This was about my children being treated as less worthy than their step-siblings. About the man who'd vowed to cherish them deciding they weren't worth investing in. For too long, I'd accepted the scraps Mark offered, afraid that pushing back would only hurt Zoe and Tyler more. I'd smiled through pickup exchanges while secretly taking on extra work to make ends meet. I'd downplayed their disappointments when plans with their father fell through. I'd made myself smaller, more accommodating, hoping it would somehow make things easier for everyone. But staring at the evidence of such blatant favoritism, something shifted inside me. My children deserved better. And for the first time since Mark walked out, I felt something other than grief and exhaustion. I felt powerful. Sunday evening, I was waiting on the porch when Mark's BMW pulled into the driveway. The kids tumbled out, Tyler chattering excitedly about the aquarium, Zoe more subdued but smiling. Mark followed behind them, checking his watch impatiently. They had dinner already, he said by way of greeting, though Tyler mostly ate ice cream, so he might be hungry again. I smiled, the expression not quite reaching my eyes. Thanks for letting me know. I need to talk to you for a minute if you have time. He glanced at his watch again. I'm meeting Vanessa for drinks in half an hour. This won't take long, I assured him, turning to the children. Guys, can you go inside and get started on your bedtime routine? I'll be in soon to help. Once they were inside, I faced Mark, squarely. I had an interesting dinner with your mother last night. His expression flickered with surprise, then wariness. My mother? What did she want? To clear her conscience, I think. I crossed my arms. She told me some fascinating things about your financial situation. The color drained from his face. Whatever she said, she's confused. You know how she gets things mixed up these days. She seemed very clear-headed to me, clear-headed enough to provide documentation. I let the statement hang between us, watching as his expression shifted from dismissive to alarmed. Documentation. Of what exactly? His voice had taken on a defensive edge. Of everything, Mark. The house, the private school tuition for Vanessa's kids, the vacations. All paid for by your father, while our children have to give up activities they love because you claim you can't afford to help more. He stared at me, mouth opening and closing, before he finally spoke. What my parents choose to do with their money is none of your business, Rebecca. It becomes my business when it affects my children, I replied, my voice steady despite the anger pulsing through me. When Zoe has to quit dance while Olivia gets private ballet lessons, when Tyler needs a math tutor I can barely afford while Jake attends a prestigious private school on your father's dime. Mark's jaw tightened. What do you want? More money? Is that what this is about? I laughed, the sound hollow even to my own ears. This isn't just about money, Mark. It's about decency. It's about treating your biological children with the same consideration you show your stepchildren. I pay what the court ordered, he snapped. I fulfill my obligations. Obligations, I repeated. Is that what Zoe and Tyler are to you now? Obligations? He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. I don't have time for this right now. We can talk about it later. We'll definitely talk about it later, I agreed. Along with my lawyer and the family court judge. I think they'll be very interested in the financial documentation your mother provided. His eyes widened. You wouldn't. I already have, I lied smoothly. My lawyer has copies of everything. We're filing for a review of the child support arrangement first thing tomorrow morning. For the first time since he'd left, I saw fear in Mark's eyes. Not fear of losing me. That ship had sailed long ago, but fear of losing the carefully constructed facade he'd built. Fear of being exposed as the father who prioritized his new family, while his biological children did without. Rebecca, be reasonable, he began, his tone shifting to the one he'd used during our marriage when trying to manage me. There's no need to involve lawyers and courts. I'm sure we can work something out. I shook my head, a strange calm settling over me. We're past that point, Mark. Way past it. As I turned to go inside, he called after me, desperation edging into his voice. What exactly are you asking for? I paused, looking back at him over my shoulder. Everything they deserve, and not a penny less. Closing the door behind me, I leaned against it, heart pounding. Through the window, I watched Mark stand frozen in the driveway for a long moment before getting back into his car and driving away. His perfect new life was about to get a lot more complicated. Inside, I found Zoe helping Tyler brush his teeth. She looked up as I entered, a question in her eyes. Is everything okay with Dad? I smiled, genuine this time. Everything's going to be fine, sweetheart. Better than fine, actually. The first time in months, I truly believed it. The documents Eleanor had given me remained spread across my dining room table as I stared at them late into the night. Long after Zoe and Tyler had gone to bed, I pored over bank statements and transfer records, still processing the magnitude of what I'd discovered. The sheer disparity was staggering. While I'd been picking up extra freelance projects just to cover basic expenses, Harold Thompson had funneled over $200,000 to Mark and Vanessa in the past year alone. My phone buzzed with a text just after midnight. Mark, we need to talk before you do anything rash. I didn't respond. For once, he could be the one waiting for an answer, wondering what would happen next. Instead, I gathered the papers and opened my laptop. If I was going to fight this battle, I needed to be prepared. By the time my alarm went off at 6 a.m. Next morning, I had 3 pages of notes, a list of questions for a lawyer, and a determination I hadn't felt in months. I moved through our morning routine with renewed energy, even as exhaustion pulled at me. Mom, are you okay? Zoe asked. as I packed her lunch. "You look tired." I smiled, smoothing her hair. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just stayed up a little late working on something important." "More graphic design stuff?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. "Actually, no. Something for our family." I zipped up her lunch bag. "Something that might make things better for us." She gave me a curious look but didn't press further. That was the thing about Zoe. At 9 years old, she'd already learned to temper her expectations. It broke my heart a little, remembering how she used to bubble over with questions and enthusiasm before the divorce. After dropping the kids at school, I drove straight to Maya's apartment. She answered the door in her pajamas, coffee mug in hand, clearly surprised by my early visit. "Rebecca? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I said, stepping past her into the apartment. In fact, something might finally be right. I spread Eleanor's documents across Maya's coffee table, explaining everything as she scanned them with widening eyes. "Holy shit," she murmured, picking up a bank statement. "So your father-in-law is bankrolling their whole life while your kids get nothing? And Eleanor just handed all this to you?" "She did." I sat back on the couch. "I think she's been feeling guilty for a long time." Maya shook her head, still flipping through papers. "This is unbelievable. Actually, no, it's totally believable. Mark always did fail upward." She looked up at me. "So what's your plan?" "I'm meeting with a lawyer today. I found someone who specializes in child support modification cases. I've already sent her an email with some of these documents attached." Maya set down her coffee mug. "Good. Make him pay." "It's not about making him pay," I countered, though part of me knew that wasn't entirely true. "It's about my children getting what they deserve." "And what about Harold?" Maya asked, arching an eyebrow. "Are you going after him too?" I hesitated. The thought had crossed my mind. Harold's favoritism wasn't just hurtful, it was creating tangible inequalities between cousins. But legally, grandparents had no obligation to provide equally for all grandchildren. "One battle at a time," I finally said. "Right now I'm focusing on Mark." Maya nodded, squeezing my hand. "I'm proud of you, Beck. It's about time you stood up for yourself." "For my kids," I corrected her. She smiled knowingly. "For all three of you." The law office of Patricia Gonzalez was located in a converted Victorian house downtown. The interior had been modernized, but touches of the original architecture remained. Crown molding, a carved staircase, stained glass insets in some of the windows. It felt warm, not sterile like I'd expected. Patricia herself was a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She scanned the documents I'd forwarded while I sat nervously across from her desk. "This is quite compelling," she said finally, looking up at me. "Your former mother-in-law took quite a risk providing these." She felt it was the right thing to do. Patricia nodded. "It certainly gives us leverage. Your ex-husband has been receiving substantial financial support that he failed to disclose during your divorce proceedings." My heart quickened. "Is that illegal?" "It's certainly grounds for revisiting the child support arrangement." She tapped her pen against the desk thoughtfully. "Most states require disclosure of all income and financial resources. If he deliberately concealed this support to reduce his child support obligations, a judge would take that very seriously." "He claimed he could barely afford the support payments as they were," I said, the old frustration bubbling up. "Meanwhile, his father was paying for private school for his stepchildren." Patricia's expression hardened. "Unfortunately, that part isn't illegal. Grandparents can distribute gifts however they choose, even if it seems blatantly unfair. But your ex-husband's failure to disclose financial resources that we can work with." She typed some notes into her computer. "I'll draft a petition for modification of child support based on these findings. We'll need to request a full financial disclosure from your ex-husband, including these payments from his father." What happens then? I asked. Best case scenario? He realizes he's cornered and agrees to a significant increase without a fight. Worst case? We go before a judge and let them decide. She smiled slightly. With this evidence, I like our chances. Either way. As I left her office an hour later, my phone was buzzing again. 3 missed calls from Mark and a string of increasingly urgent text messages. I know Eleanor talked to you. Let's discuss this rationally. Rebecca, ignoring me isn't going to help anything. At least tell me what you're planning to do. I smiled grimly and sent back a single text. My lawyer will be in touch. His response came immediately. You're making a mistake. I slipped my phone back into my purse without replying. For too long, I'd been made to feel like standing up for myself, for my children, was unreasonable. Those days were over. When I picked up the kids from school that afternoon, I tried to maintain our normal routine despite the storm brewing. Tyler chatted about his day while Zoe worked quietly on homework at the kitchen table. I was chopping vegetables for dinner when my phone rang again. Not Mark this time, but Harold Thompson. My finger hovered over the decline button before curiosity won out. Hello? Rebecca. His voice was controlled, formal, as it had always. Been with me. I understand you had dinner with Eleanor recently. I continued chopping carrots, the rhythmic sound grounding me. That's right. And she shared some personal financial information with you? She did. A pause. I'd like to discuss this matter with you privately. Perhaps over lunch tomorrow? I set down the knife. I don't think that would be productive, Harold. I've already consulted with a lawyer. I heard his sharp intake of breath. That seems rather excessive. This is a family matter. Yes, it is, I agreed, anger seeping into my tone despite my efforts to remain calm. It's about my family, my children, being treated as less valuable than Vanessa's. Now that's simply not true, he protested. Mark receives support as my son. How he chooses to use that support is his business. And how he chooses to neglect his responsibilities to Zoe and Tyler is my business, I countered. Did you know? Zoe had to quit dance classes because Mark claimed he couldn't afford to help with the expenses? Meanwhile, you're paying thousands for Olivia's private ballet instructor. Silence stretched between us before Harold spoke again, his voice colder now. I don't appreciate being made to feel guilty for helping my son and his family. His family includes Zoe and Tyler, I said quietly. Or have you forgotten that? This conversation is clearly not productive. His tone was dismissive now. I had hoped to resolve this amicably, but if you insist on being confrontational— I insist on my children being treated fairly, I interrupted. Nothing more, nothing less. I'll have my lawyer contact yours, he said stiffly. I look forward to it. I ended the call and set my phone down, hands trembling slightly. I turned to find Zoe standing in the kitchen doorway, watching me. Was that Grandpa? She asked quietly. I nodded, unsure how much she'd heard. Yes, sweetheart. Are you fighting with him too? The two broke my heart a little. In her young mind, conflict had become the norm, arguments the expected outcome of any interaction with her father's side of the family. I beckoned her over and wrapped my arms around her. It's not really fighting. We just have different ideas about some important things. She leaned against me. Is it about Dad? Sort of. I chose my words carefully. It's about making sure you and Tyler have everything you need and deserve. She was quiet for a moment. Like dance classes? My throat tightened. Yes, like dance classes. She nodded against my shoulder. I miss dancing. I know, baby. I kissed the top of her head. And I'm going to do everything I can to get you back in those classes. Promise? Promise? After the kids were asleep, I sat in the quiet of my living room, mentally preparing for what was coming. I knew Mark and Harold well enough to know they wouldn't give in easily. They would fight. They would try to intimidate me. They would paint me as greedy or vindictive. But for once, I didn't care what they thought of me. My phone chimed with an email notification from Patricia Gonzalez. She had drafted the petition for modification and attached it for my review. Reading through the legal language, it all seemed so clinical, a stark contrast to the emotional weight of what we were fighting for. But seeing it laid out formally, with dollar amounts and financial discrepancies clearly stated, strengthened my resolve. I approved the petition and tried to sleep, but rest eluded me. Around midnight, I gave up and went to check on the children. Tyler was sprawled across his bed, one leg hanging off the side, his favorite stuffed dinosaur clutched against his chest. I gently repositioned him and tucked the covers around his small frame. In Zoe's room, I found her curled on her side, her dance recital photo still displayed prominently on her nightstand despite months of not being able to attend classes. I straightened her blanket and brushed a strand of hair from her face. These quiet moments watching my children sleep had always centered me, reminded me of what mattered. In the morning, the battle would begin in earnest, but tonight, I drew strength from their peaceful faces and the certainty that I was fighting for something that truly mattered. The next day brought the first salvo in what would become a prolonged conflict. Patricia informed me that she had filed our petition and served Mark with the papers. His response came within hours. A call from his own lawyer, a slick corporate attorney named James Whitfield, who primarily handled business litigation but occasionally helped out friends with family matters. "Mrs. Wilson," he began, his tone condescending. "I'm hoping we can resolve this misunderstanding without unnecessary legal proceedings." "It's Ms. Wilson now," I corrected him. "And there's no misunderstanding. My ex-husband concealed financial resources during our divorce. My client merely received occasional gifts from his parents, hardly reportable income." I laughed shortly. "Mr. Whitfield, we have documentation of regular monthly transfers, tuition payments, housing assistance, all of which should have been disclosed when determining child support." A pause. "Those documents were obtained under questionable circumstances." "The circumstances don't change the facts," I countered. "Your client has been receiving substantial financial support while claiming he couldn't afford to properly support his biological children. I'll advise my client to offer a small increase in monthly support as a gesture of goodwill," he said, as if granting a great concession. "Say, an additional $200 per month." The insult of it sent heat rushing to my face. $200 when Harold was paying over $40,000 annually for Vanessa's children's private school tuition alone. "That's not going to work," I said flatly. "We're asking for an increase proportionate to the actual financial resources at his disposal, plus retroactive payments for the months he's been shortchanging his children." "Ms. Wilson, be reasonable." "I am being extremely reasonable," I interrupted. "The alternative is taking this before a judge and requesting a full financial investigation, which would include Mr. Thompson's contributions. Is that really what your client wants?" Silence stretched between us. "I'll discuss your position with my client," he finally said, his tone noticeably cooler. "Please do. And Mr. Whitfield? The longer this drags on, the more it's going to cost everyone involved, financially and otherwise." After we hung up, I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. I'd never spoken to anyone that way before, certainly not an opposing attorney. The old Rebecca would have been intimidated, would have accepted whatever scraps they offered just to avoid conflict. But that Rebecca was gone. The rest of the day passed in a blur of work and routine childcare. I was helping Tyler with a science project when my phone rang again, Eleanor this time. "Rebecca?" Her voice was hushed, as if she was worried about being overheard. "How are you?" "Managing," I replied cautiously. I assume you've heard from Harold? A soft, humorless laugh. Oh, yes. He's quite upset with me. Says I've betrayed the family. I'm sorry, I said, genuinely meaning it. I never meant to. Cause problems between you two. The problems were already there, she said wearily. This just brought them to the surface. But that's not why I'm calling. I wanted to warn you. Mark and Harold are meeting tonight to strategize. Harold has been making calls all day. My stomach tightened. Calls to whom? His golf buddies. The judge who married them into country club membership last year. People with influence. Of course. Harold Thompson had always been proud of his connections, his ability to pull strings when necessary. It shouldn't have surprised me that he'd use those connections now. Thank you for telling me, I said quietly. They're going to try to paint you as money-hungry, she continued. They'll say you're using the children as pawns. I closed my eyes briefly. Let them try. Be careful, Rebecca. Harold can be ruthless when he feels threatened. After we hung up, I called Patricia immediately to relay what Eleanor had told me. She listened without interruption, then sighed heavily. Unfortunately, this kind of behind-the-scenes maneuvering isn't uncommon in high-conflict cases, but judges are generally wise to it. What if they're not? I asked, fear creeping in for the first time. What if Harold's connections actually work? Then we expose that too, she said firmly. If there's even a hint of impropriety or undue influence, we'll bring it to light. Remember, Rebecca, we have the facts on our side. All they have is smoke and mirrors. I wished I shared her confidence. That night, I tossed and turned, imagining scenarios where Mark and Harold's influence overcame truth and justice, where I ended up worse off than before, possibly even losing custody time if they painted me as unstable or greedy. By morning, my anxiety had crystallized into determination. If they wanted to fight dirty, I would be prepared. I spent my lunch break researching Harold's business connections, making notes of potential conflicts of interest with local judges or attorneys. I wasn't planning to use the information, but having it made me feel less vulnerable. When I picked up the kids from school, Zoe had an unexpected announcement. Dad called my teacher today, she said as she climbed into the car. I froze with my hand on the ignition. What? Why? She shrugged, buckling her seatbelt. Mrs. Peterson just said he had some questions about how I'm doing in school. Alarm bells rang in my mind. Mark had never shown particular interest in the children's education before, certainly not enough to call their teachers directly. This had to be part of their strategy, laying groundwork to question my parenting or establish himself as the more involved parent. Did she say anything else? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. No, just that Dad seemed very concerned. About me. She frowned slightly. Am I in trouble or something? Of course not, sweetheart. I reached over to squeeze her hand. You're doing great in school. As soon as we got home, I called Mrs. Peterson, identifying myself and asking about Mark's call. Oh, yes, she said, sounding slightly confused. Mr. Wilson called this morning. He asked quite a few questions about Zoe's performance, whether she seemed stressed or unhappy, if there had been any concerning changes in her behavior recently. My grip tightened on the phone. And what did you tell him? That Zoe is a delightful student who's doing well academically and socially, she replied promptly. She's a bit quieter than she was last year, but that's not unusual given the circumstances. Children of divorce often need time to adjust. I exhaled slowly. Did he say why he was asking these questions? He mentioned something about wanting to make sure she was thriving in her current environment. A pause. Ms. Wilson, is everything all right? I got the impression there might be some tension regarding custody arrangements. Everything's fine, I assured her, even as anger built in my chest. Thank you for letting me know. After hanging up, I immediately called Patricia again. They're building a custody case, I told her without preamble. Mark called Zoe's teacher today, asking if she seemed unhappy or stressed. Patricia was silent for a moment. It's a common tactic, she finally said. When faced with increased financial obligations, some parents threaten custody battles as leverage. Leverage, I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. My children were being used as bargaining chips. Don't panic, Patricia advised. This is actually good news in a way. It means they're worried about the financial case we're building. They wouldn't resort to these tactics if they thought they could win on the merits of the child support issue alone. So, what do? Document everything. Every call, every unusual request, every change in pattern. And Rebecca, don't give them anything to work with. Be absolutely beyond reproach in every aspect of parenting right now. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table, a new wave of determination washing over me. They thought they could intimidate me by threatening what I loved most. They had miscalculated badly. That evening, I helped both children with homework, prepared a balanced dinner, supervised bath time, and read bedtime stories, our normal routine, but performed with a hyper-awareness that my parenting might soon be under scrutiny. After they were asleep, I methodically documented every aspect of their care in a notebook: meals, activities, homework, bedtimes, creating a record no one had asked for yet, but that I sensed I might need. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark. We need to talk about what's best for the kids. I stared at it for a long moment before typing back. I agree. They deserve parents who prioritize their needs. His response came quickly. I've always prioritized them. I almost laughed out loud at the audacity. Instead, I replied, actions speak louder than words, Mark. Good night. I set my phone aside and continued my documentation, adding Mark's new interest in Zoe's schooling to the timeline I was creating. If he wanted to question my parenting, I would be ready with a meticulous record of my own, and of his conspicuous absences and sudden convenient concern. As I wrote, a strange calm settled over me. For months after the divorce, I'd felt like I was drowning, struggling to keep my head above water financially, emotionally, parentally. Now, even in the midst of this new conflict, I felt something I hadn't expected: strength, clarity, purpose. They thought they could use my children to break me. Instead, they had given me the final push I needed to truly fight back. Later that night, I received an unexpected text from Eleanor. Harold meeting with family court Judge Williams tomorrow. Golf and lunch at the country club. Thought you should. No. I forwarded it directly to Patricia, who responded with a phone call rather than a text. This could actually work in our favor, she said when I answered. If they're attempting to influence the proceedings improperly, it gives us grounds to request a different judge if Judge Williams ends up assigned to our case. Should we do something now? I asked. No, we document and wait. Let them dig their own hole. She paused. Rebecca, are you holding up okay? These situations can be incredibly stressful. The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on strategy and next steps that I hadn't really stopped to consider my own emotional state. I'm angry, I admitted after a moment. Angry that they're trying to use my children as pawns. Angry that Mark abandoned his responsibilities so easily, but now wants to pretend he's father of the year. Just angry. Good, Patricia said, surprising me. Anger can be productive when it's channeled properly. Just don't let it cloud your judgment. I won't, I promised. They've underestimated me for too long. I won't give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. When we hung up, I returned to my notebook, adding Eleanor's text to my timeline. The picture emerging was clear. Mark and Harold were scrambling, pulling whatever strings they could, because they knew they were vulnerable. They knew I had legitimate grievances backed by solid evidence. For the first time since Mark had walked out of our marriage, I felt like I had the upper hand, and I intended to use it, not for revenge, but for justice, for my children's future. As I finally climbed into bed that night, exhaustion pulling at me, my last thought before sleep claimed me wasn't of fear or worry. It was of determination. They had awakened something in me they never expected and would soon regret. A mother who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Morning came with the soft ping of an email notification. I reached for my phone, squinting at the screen in the dim light of dawn. It was from Patricia, sent at 5:47 a.m. Court date set. 2 weeks from today, Judge Catherine Martinez presiding. Good news. She's known for being thorough and fair in support modification cases. Prepare for escalation from the other side. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. 2 weeks. It seemed both an eternity and no time at all to prepare. I typed back a quick acknowledgement and slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the children. They needed their rest. The days ahead would be challenging enough. In the kitchen, I brewed coffee and opened my laptop, reviewing the financial documentation for the 100th time. Each figure represented a choice Mark and Harold had made, a choice to prioritize Vanessa's children over Zoe and Tyler. The familiar anger rose in my chest, but I channeled it into preparation, making notes for Patricia about specific transfers we should highlight. My phone rang just as I was closing my laptop to wake the kids for school. Mark's name flashed on the screen. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but decided it was better to know what he was planning. Hello? A court date, Rebecca? Really? His voice was tight with barely controlled fury. You couldn't even try to work this out privately? We tried that route, I reminded him. Your lawyer offered an insulting $200 more per month when your father is paying $40,000 a year just for private school tuition for your stepchildren. That's completely different. How? I interrupted. Explain to me how it's different. A beat of silence. Those payments aren't to me. They're for the children's education. And what do you think I'm fighting for here, Mark? Luxury items for myself? This is about our children's education, their activities, their quality of life. He exhaled sharply. Look, I know things have been tight for you. Don't. I cut him off. Don't pretend this is about my financial management. This is about you hiding resources during our divorce to minimize your obligations to your biological children. I didn't hide anything, he protested. Dad's help came after the divorce. I laughed shortly. We both know that's not true. The first transfer was 2 weeks before our final hearing, and you didn't disclose it. Another pause. How much do you want, Rebecca? Just tell me a number so we can end this circus. The question caught me off guard. Part of me was tempted to name a figure, to find the quickest path to resolution. But I knew it wasn't that simple. It's not just about a number, Mark. It's about ongoing support proportionate to your actual resources, and it's about equal treatment. For all your children, including future expenses like college. College? He repeated, his voice rising. They're in elementary school. And they'll be in college before we know it, I said evenly. Olivia and Jake have trust funds from your father. What do Zoe and Tyler have? Silence stretched between us. When he finally spoke, his voice had a dangerous edge. Be careful, Rebecca. You're pushing too hard on this. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. You think you know what you're doing, but you don't understand the consequences of taking this to court. My grip tightened on the phone. I understand perfectly. I understand that you and your father thought you could shortchange your children indefinitely, and I'd be too beaten down to fight back. You miscalculated. Dad has connections you can't imagine, Mark warned. Judges, lawyers, people who matter in this town. Do you really want to go up against that? If those connections are being used to influence family court decisions, That's called corruption, Mark. Is that really the route you want to take? He exhaled sharply. You know what? Fine. We'll see you in court, but don't come crying to me when this blows up in your face. The line went dead. I stood there in my kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear, my heart racing. Despite his threats, I felt strangely empowered. Mark was scared. He wouldn't be pushing so hard for a private settlement if he wasn't worried about what a judge would say. I heard small footsteps on the stairs and quickly composed myself. Tyler appeared in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep, his favorite dinosaur pajamas rumpled. "Morning, buddy," I said, forcing brightness into my voice. "Ready for breakfast?" He nodded sleepily, climbing onto a stool at the counter. "Can I have dinosaur pancakes?" "Of course you can." I set to work mixing batter, grateful for the distraction of normal morning routines. Whatever storms were brewing, my children deserved peaceful breakfasts and dinosaur-shaped pancakes. Zoe joined us a few minutes later, already dressed for school, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Mom, don't forget I need to bring in my poster for the science fair today." "It's by the door, all ready to go," I assured her, flipping pancakes onto plates. "Did you sleep okay?" She nodded, but I noticed the slight shadows under her eyes. "I guess. I had a weird dream about Dad." My hands stilled momentarily. "Oh? What kind of dream?" She poked at her pancake with her fork. "He was taking us to this huge house, but when we got inside, there were no rooms for us, just for Olivia and Jake." My heart constricted. Even in sleep, she was processing the inequality of her father's affections. I moved around the counter and wrapped my arms around her slender shoulders. "It was just a dream, sweetheart. And you know what? In our house, you and Tyler will always have your rooms, your space, your place. Always." She leaned into me briefly before straightening. "I know, Mom. It was just a stupid dream." But it wasn't just a dream. It was her subconscious articulating what she perceived but couldn't yet fully express, that her father had made choices that made her feel forgotten, replaced, less important. As I drove them to school, I made a silent promise to both my children. Whatever happened in court, whatever tactics Mark and Harold employed, I would protect them, not just physically and financially, but emotionally. I would show them what it meant to stand up for yourself with dignity and determination. My workday was punctuated with strategy calls with Patricia and worried texts from Eleanor, who reported that Harold was making calls morning till night and had meetings scheduled with 3 different attorneys. I tried to focus on my design projects, but my mind kept drifting to the court date looming ahead and Mark's thinly veiled threats. When I picked up the kids from school, Zoe was quieter than usual. In the rearview mirror, I could see her staring out the window, lost in thought. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" I asked as we pulled into our driveway. She hesitated before answering. "Dad called me today." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "He did? What did he say?" "He asked if I was happy living with you, if I ever felt sad or scared." Her voice was small. "He said if I ever wanted to live with him instead, he could talk to a judge and make it happen." The blood in my veins turned to ice. So this was their strategy, using my 9-year-old daughter as a pawn, trying to manipulate her into expressing dissatisfaction with her living situation. "What did you tell him?" I asked carefully, fighting to keep my voice neutral. "I told him I like living with you," she said simply. "I like my room and my school and my friends." Relief washed over me, followed quickly by renewed anger at Mark. How dare he put our daughter in that position, trying to extract statements he could use against me in court? "That was an unfair question for Dad to ask you," I said gently. "Adults should work out adult problems without involving children." She nodded, still looking troubled. "He sounded different. Sort of. Urgent. Like he really wanted me to say I wanted to live with him. I helped Tyler with his seatbelt, buying myself a moment to control my expression. Well, whatever happens, what matters most is that you and Tyler feel safe and loved. I do, Tyler piped up cheerfully, oblivious to the tension. Can we have pizza for dinner? I forced a smile. You know what? Pizza sounds perfect. Inside, once the kids were settled with snacks and homework, I called Patricia immediately. He called Zoe directly at school, I said without preamble. Asked if she was happy living with me. Told her he could get a judge to let her live with him if she wanted. Patricia's intake of breath was audible. That's highly inappropriate. Did she tell you this unprompted? Yes, on the way home from school. Good. Write down exactly what she said, word for word as best you can remember it. Date, time, everything. We may need to bring this up with the judge. Is this normal? I asked, my voice breaking slightly. Using children this way? Patricia sighed. Unfortunately, when parents feel cornered financially, they sometimes resort to custody threats as leverage. But contacting a child directly to fish for negative statements about the other parent? That crosses a line. After we hung up, I documented the conversation as Patricia had instructed, my hand shaking slightly as I wrote. When I finished, I sat at my kitchen table, a sudden wave of exhaustion washing over me. This wasn't just about money anymore. Mark was actively trying to undermine my relationship with our children to avoid financial responsibility. My phone buzzed with a text. From an unknown number. This is Vanessa. Can we meet? Just us. It's important. I stared at the message in disbelief. Vanessa? Mark's new wife wanted to meet with me? Why now? Curiosity won out over caution. I replied, when and where? She suggested a coffee shop across town, far from where either of us typically went. Neutral territory. We agreed on the following afternoon during the children's school hours. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine, trying to quiet my racing thoughts. What could Vanessa possibly want? Was this another tactic from Mark's playbook? Using his wife to extract information or catch me saying something they could use against me? Or was it possible she was as uncomfortable with this situation as I was? After all, her children were at the center of this disparity. Did she know the extent of Harold's financial support? Did she understand that it came at the expense of Zoe and Tyler? Sleep came fitfully that night, my dreams filled with courtrooms and faceless judges pointing accusatory fingers. I woke earlier than usual, exhausted but too anxious to remain in bed. I spent the extra time reviewing my documentation, adding notes about Mark's call to Zoe, preparing mentally for my meeting with Vanessa. After dropping the kids at school, I drove to the agreed-upon coffee shop, arriving 15 minutes early. I chose a table in the corner with a clear view of the entrance and ordered a latte, my stomach too knotted for food. Vanessa arrived precisely, on time, her polished appearance a stark contrast to my hastily assembled outfit. She wore a tailored blazer over a silk blouse, her dark hair falling in perfect waves, diamond studs glinting in her ears. The engagement ring on her finger was at least twice the size of the one Mark had given me. She spotted me and walked over, her expression unreadable. Rebecca, thank you for meeting me. I was curious, I admitted as she sat down across from me. This is unexpected. She ordered a green tea from the hovering waitress before meeting my eyes directly. I know about the court case. I assumed you did. Not just that it exists. She leaned forward slightly. I know why you're doing it. I know about Harold's financial support. I studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. And I think you should know that I didn't ask for any of it. Her voice was measured, controlled. The private school, the trust funds, the house down payment, that was all Harold and Mark's doing. I actually wanted my kids in public school, where they'd been perfectly happy before. This was not what I'd expected. Why are you telling me this? She glanced down at her tea, then back up at me. Because I don't think it's fair. What's happening to your children, I mean? I have 2 kids of my own. I understand wanting the best for them. Yet you're benefiting from the arrangement, I pointed out. Yes, she acknowledged without defensiveness. And that puts me in a difficult position. Mark is my husband now. His father has been incredibly generous to my children. But she hesitated. The way they're treating Zoe and Tyler isn't right. I sat back, trying to process this unexpected ally. Does Mark know you're here? No, he'd be furious. She twisted her wedding ring nervously. But things have been tense since the court papers were served. Mark and Harold are constantly in meetings, constantly strategizing. The more they fight your request for increased support, the more I question why they're fighting so hard. Because they don't want to part with money they'd rather spend elsewhere, I said bluntly. Vanessa nodded slowly. Maybe. But I think it's more than that for Harold. It's about control. Control? Over Mark, over the family narrative. She sipped her tea. Harold has very specific ideas about family hierarchy and loyalty. In his mind, Mark chose me and my children, so we became the priority family unit. Your children. She paused, looking genuinely uncomfortable. In Harold's mind, they're secondary now. The casual cruelty of it stunned me into momentary silence. Secondary. Less important. Less worthy of investment and attention. Not because of anything they'd done, but simply because their father had moved on. That's a terrible way to view innocent children, I finally said. I agree, Vanessa said quietly. Which is why I wanted to meet. I have information that might help your case. My guard immediately rose. This could still be a trap. What kind of information? Financial records Harold doesn't know I've seen. Conversations I've overheard between him and Mark. Details about their strategy for the court case. Why would you help me? I asked, suspicion clear in my voice. You risk your own financial security if I win. She met my gaze steadily. Because I have children too. And I wouldn't want anyone treating them as less important, less worthy of love and support, just because of adult decisions they had no part in. There was a sincerity in her eyes that was difficult to dismiss. Still, caution prevailed. I appreciate the sentiment, but I can't help wondering if this is some sort of setup. Vanessa reached into her purse and withdrew a manila envelope, sliding it across the table to me. I understand your skepticism, so I brought proof of my intentions. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside were printouts of emails between Harold and Mark, discussing strategies to minimize child support payments, despite Harold's significant financial contributions to their household. One particularly damning exchange had Harold suggesting they find a sympathetic psychologist who could testify that the children would benefit from spending more time with their father. Not because he genuinely wanted more custody, but because it would reduce his support obligation. I looked up at Vanessa, genuinely shocked. How did you get these? Mark uses my laptop sometimes when his is at the office. He forgets to log out of his email. She shrugged slightly. I wasn't snooping initially. I just needed to check. My own email and his was still open. But once I saw what they were planning, I flipped through more of the documents. Bank statements showing transfers from Harold labeled as gifts, but structured in ways that looked designed to avoid financial disclosure. Notes from a meeting with their lawyer discussing ways to challenge my fitness as a mother if the support case seemed to be going in my favor. This is comprehensive, I said finally. I've been collecting it for weeks, Vanessa admitted. ever since I realized how far they were willing to go to avoid treating all the children fairly. Why now? Why not wait until after the court hearing? She sighed, a hint of vulnerability cracking her composed facade. Because they're escalating, Rebecca. That call to Zoe? That was just the beginning. They're building a case to seek primary custody if you don't back down on the financial demands. A cold knot formed in my stomach. On what grounds? They're grasping at straws. Suggesting your work schedule makes you unavailable, implying the children's emotional needs aren't being met. Basically anything they can think of. She leaned forward. It's all fabricated, but Harold has influence. He's already tried to get the case assigned to Judge Williams, who's a regular at his country club. I thought of Eleanor's warning about Harold's meeting with that same judge. So you're trying to protect my children from losing their mother? I'm trying to protect all the children from being pawns in Harold's power games, she corrected, including mine. This dynamic isn't healthy for anyone. I studied her face, looking for signs of deception and finding none. Either she was an exceptional actress, or she was genuinely concerned about the situation. What exactly are you offering, Vanessa? Information, testimony if needed, though I hope it won't come to that, and… She hesitated. A potential compromise that might satisfy everyone. I'm listening. Harold has set up trust funds for my children's education. Substantial ones. What if he were to establish equal trusts for Zoe and Tyler? And what if Mark agreed to a support increase that reflects the actual household income, including Harold's contributions? I raised an eyebrow. You think you can convince them to agree to that? I think I can try. Harold values his public image above almost everything. If he thought this might become public, the disparity in how he treats his grandchildren, it would mortify him. She tapped the envelope. And these emails would be extremely embarrassing if they came to light. I considered her offer carefully. It was tempting, a potential resolution without the uncertainty of a court battle. But something didn't quite add up. Why did you marry him? I asked abruptly. Mark, I mean. If you're concerned about his ethics, his treatment of his first family. Vanessa's expression softened slightly. I didn't know then what I know now. When Mark and I first got together, he painted a very different picture of his first marriage, of you, of his relationship with his children. By the time I saw the reality, she twisted her wedding ring again. We were already married, our families blended. It's complicated. Life usually is, I acknowledged. She glanced at her watch. I should go. I told Mark I was having brunch with a client. He doesn't know you don't have clients on Thursdays? A small, sad smile crossed her face. Mark doesn't know my schedule at all. He's never asked. As she stood to leave, I felt a surprising pang of empathy for this woman I'd resented for so long. Perhaps she wasn't the villain in this story, or at least not the only one. Thank you, I said quietly, for the information, and for caring about my children's welfare. She nodded. I'll be in touch about that compromise. In the meantime, she gestured to the envelope. Use those if you need to, just maybe not right away. Give me a chance to work on them first. After she left, I sat for a long time, turning over our conversation in my mind. Could I trust Vanessa? Was her offer of help genuine, or part of some elaborate strategy I couldn't yet see? I sent a quick text to Patricia. Need to meet ASAP. Have new information. Her response came minutes later. My office, 1 p.m. I gathered the documents Vanessa had provided and headed to Patricia's office, my mind racing with possibilities. If these emails were authentic, they revealed a level of calculation and manipulation I hadn't fully appreciated. They also provided leverage I hadn't expected to have. Patricia examined the documents carefully, her expression growing increasingly grim. "These appear legitimate," she said finally. "The email headers, the consistent writing style, the timestamps. If they're fabricated, it's an extremely sophisticated job." "So they help our case?" "Tremendously," she confirmed. "They demonstrate not only that Mark was receiving undisclosed financial support, but that he and his father were actively conspiring to minimize his obligations to his children. And the custody threats as leverage?" She shook her head in disgust. "No family court judge would look kindly on that." "Vanessa suggested a compromise," I told her. "Equal trust funds for Zoe and Tyler, plus increased support that reflects the actual household income." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "And you believe she can deliver on that?" "I'm not sure," I admitted, "but she seems genuinely troubled by the situation." "Keep these documents safe," Patricia advised, handing them back to me. "Make copies. We'll hold off on using them in court for now, see if this compromise materializes. But if they try anything regarding custody, we'll use everything we have." As I left her office, I felt a strange mix of hope and apprehension. The documents provided security, a nuclear option if Mark and Harold escalated further. But the prospect of a negotiated resolution was appealing, especially if it meant sparing the children the trauma of a custody battle. I picked up the kids from school, studying their faces as they climbed into the car. Did they sense the tension, the precariousness of our situation? I had tried to shield them from the ugly details, but children were perceptive. They knew something was happening. "How was school today?" I asked, watching Zoe in the rearview mirror. "Fine," she said with a shrug. Then, after a pause, "Dad texted me again." My grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Oh? What did he say?" "He wanted to know if I'd thought more about spending extra time at his house, like maybe more than just weekends." The confirmation of Vanessa's warning sent a chill through me. They were already laying groundwork, trying to establish Zoe's desire for more time with her father. "What did you tell him?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral with effort. I didn't answer yet. She looked out the window. "I don't know what to say." "You can say whatever feels true to you, sweetheart," I told her gently. "No one should pressure you either way." She nodded, but remained silent for the rest of the drive home. As we pulled into our driveway, my phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. "Meeting with H tonight. We'll update tomorrow." I helped the children with homework, made dinner, supervised bath time, all the while feeling like we were in the eye of a hurricane, a deceptive calm before the storm hit again. I checked the locks twice before going to bed, a new habit born of a sense of vulnerability I couldn't quite shake. Sleep eluded me as I replayed the day's events. Vanessa's revelations, the damning emails, the escalating custody threats. Was I doing the right thing, pushing this fight forward? Or was I putting my children at risk of an even more painful outcome? Around midnight, my phone lit up with a text. It was from Eleanor. "Harold came home furious from meeting with Mark and Vanessa. Something's happened. Be careful." I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, the warning settling over me like a physical weight. Whatever Vanessa had said to them, it had clearly struck a nerve. The question was whether that would make them more willing to compromise or more determined to fight. Either way, tomorrow would bring a new phase of this battle, and I needed to be ready. Morning arrived with a flurry of unexpected activity. As I was pouring cereal for the kids, my phone rang, Patricia calling hours earlier than usual. "Rebecca, I just received a settlement offer from Mark's attorney," she said without preamble. "They want to meet today. All parties, including Harold." I nearly dropped the milk carton. "Today? Why the sudden urgency?" "That's what I'd like to know," Patricia replied. "The timing is suspicious, especially after those documents Vanessa gave you. Can you make it to my office at 11? I glanced at the kitchen clock. Getting childcare on such short notice would be challenging. I'll figure something out. After hanging up, I called Maya, who agreed to pick up the kids from school if the meeting ran long. Then I contacted my freelance client to reschedule our afternoon call. By the time I dropped Zoe and Tyler at school, my stomach was in knots. Have a great day, I told them, hugging each tightly. Maya might pick you up today. I have an important meeting. Zoe's perceptive eyes met mine. About Dad? I nodded, seeing no point in lying. Yes, sweetheart. About making things more fair for everyone. She seemed to weigh this information before nodding. Okay. Good luck, Mom. The maturity in her young voice nearly broke me. At 9 years old, she shouldn't have to understand concepts like legal proceedings and financial fairness. Yet here she was, processing it all with quiet dignity. Patricia's office was already buzzing with activity when I arrived. Her assistant ushered me into a small conference room where Patricia was reviewing documents. They're early, she said, nodding toward the lobby. Mark, his attorney, and Harold are all out there. No Vanessa, though, which is interesting. What are they offering? I asked, setting my purse down and trying to project more confidence than I felt. Patricia slid a document across the table. See for yourself. The proposal was surprisingly comprehensive. Mark would increase monthly child support by $1,200, a significant bump from the current amount. Harold would establish educational trusts for Zoe and Tyler, equal to those he'd created for Vanessa's children. Mark would cover all extracurricular activities and medical expenses not covered by insurance. I looked up at Patricia. This is, actually reasonable. Too reasonable, she said, her expression cautious. Given how hard they were fighting just yesterday, this complete reversal raises questions. Vanessa, I murmured. She must have followed through on her promise to talk to them. Perhaps, Patricia acknowledged. But remember, Rebecca, people who've been playing hardball don't suddenly adopt a spirit of generosity without reason. There's likely a catch. She was right, of course. Mark and Harold hadn't shown any indication they valued fairness or cared about Zoe and Tyler's needs. This sudden capitulation had to have an ulterior motive. What do you think they want? I asked. We'll find out soon enough. Patricia gathered her papers. Are you ready? I took a deep breath and nodded. Whatever they were planning, I would face it directly. No more cowering, no more accepting scraps and calling it generosity. The atmosphere in the larger conference room was frigid as we entered. Mark sat beside his attorney, James Whitfield, his expression unreadable. Harold Thompson occupied the chair at the far end of the table, radiating displeasure, his silver hair immaculately combed, his expensive suit a silent statement of power. Ms. Wilson, Ms. Gonzalez, Whitfield greeted us with practiced cordiality. Thank you for meeting on such short notice. Patricia nodded curtly. Your offer was unexpected. We're interested in understanding what prompted this change of position. Harold shifted in his chair but remained silent, his eyes fixed on me with undisguised hostility. Mark cleared his throat. We've reconsidered our position, he said stiffly. Family harmony is important. The children shouldn't suffer because of adult disagreements. The platitude sounded rehearsed, hollow coming from a man who had shown so little concern for his children's well-being until now. I'm glad you've come to that realization, I replied evenly. Your offer seems fair on its surface. On its surface? Harold finally spoke, his tone sharp. It's more than fair. It's generous. Patricia held up a hand. Let's be clear. It's not generous to properly support your biological children. It's the bare minimum expectation. Harold's jaw tightened, but Whitfield intervened smoothly. There is one additional condition to our offer that isn't included in the written proposal. And there it was, the catch Patricia had predicted. I steeled myself. What condition? I asked. Mark and Harold exchanged a glance before Whitfield continued. All documentation related to Harold Thompson's financial support of Mark Wilson's household must be returned and destroyed. No copies retained. And a confidentiality agreement must be signed by all parties, including Ms. Wilson's mother-in-law, Eleanor Thompson. Ah. So that was it. The emails Vanessa had provided, the bank statements Eleanor had shared, they were afraid of exposure. Not just in court, but publicly. Harold's reputation as a pillar of the community couldn't withstand the revelation that he'd enabled his son to neglect his children while lavishing resources on his stepchildren. Patricia leaned forward. To be clear, you're offering this settlement because you're concerned about those documents becoming public? We're offering it because it's right for the children, Whitfield insisted unconvincingly. The confidentiality requirement is simply good business practice. Good business practice, I repeated slowly. Is that how you view your grandchildren, Harold? As a business transaction? Harold's face flushed. Don't presume to lecture me about family, Rebecca. I'm the one offering to establish substantial trusts for the children. After systematically excluding them for years, I pointed out. After helping Mark minimize his support obligations while funding every aspect of his new life. That's enough, Mark snapped. Do you want the deal or not? Because this is the only offer you're getting. Patricia placed a restraining hand on my arm, but I was done being silenced. Actually, Mark, I don't think it is. Because if these terms aren't acceptable, we'll not only proceed with the court case, we'll share those emails with the judge. The ones where you and your father discuss finding a sympathetic psychologist to help reduce your support obligations. The ones where Harold suggests using custody as leverage against me. The color drained from Mark's face. Harold's eyes narrowed to slits. Where did you get those emails? He demanded. I smiled thinly. That's not important. What matters is that I have them. And if this settlement doesn't adequately address all my concerns, the judge will see them too. Whitfield leaned over to whisper something to Mark, who shook his head sharply. The tension in the room was palpable. What else do you want? Mark finally asked, his voice tight. I hadn't expected the question. I glanced at Patricia, who gave me a subtle nod, encouraging me to continue. First, I want the trust funds established before we sign anything, not as a promise for the future. I want documentation proving they're equal to what you've provided for Olivia and Jake. Harold made a sound of protest, but I pressed on. Second, I want a written apology from both of you. Not for me, for Zoe and Tyler. Acknowledging that they've been treated unfairly and committing to equal treatment going forward. An apology? Harold scoffed. Absolutely not. Then we're done here, I said, beginning to gather my belongings. See you in court. Wait, Mark said quickly, shooting his father a warning look. We can discuss the apology. What else? I paused, considering my next words carefully. Third, I want you to stop. Stop using the children as pawns. Stop calling Zoe to ask leading questions about living arrangements. Stop trying to manipulate her into saying she wants more time with you just to reduce your financial obligations. Mark had the grace to look uncomfortable. Don't, I cut him off. She told me about the calls, Mark. She's 9, not stupid. Silence fell over the room. Harold was the first to recover, straightening his tie with deliberate precision. We'll need time to consider these additional terms, he said stiffly. Patricia intervened. You have until the end of the day. After that, we proceed with court preparations. Whitfield nodded reluctantly. We'll be in touch. As we gathered our things to leave, Harold suddenly addressed me directly. You know, Rebecca, I never understood what Mark saw in you, but I'm beginning to see you're more clever than I gave you credit for. The words were delivered as if they were an insult, but I chose to receive them differently. Thank you, Harold. I'm more of a lot of things than you gave me credit for. Outside in the hallway, Patricia gave me an approving nod. You held your ground beautifully. Those additional demands were inspired. Do you think they'll agree? I asked as we walked toward her office. They'd be fools not to, she replied. The alternative is public exposure of their manipulation, plus a likely increased support order from the court. Their offer is already close to what we'd expect. To win in court, so they're clearly motivated to settle. It was the emails, wasn't it? That's what changed everything. Patricia nodded. Almost certainly. Which raises the question, how did Vanessa get access to them? And why would she turn them over to you? It was a question I'd been pondering since yesterday's coffee shop meeting. She said she wanted fairness for all the children, that she was uncomfortable with the disparity. Perhaps, Patricia said, not sounding entirely convinced. Or perhaps there's more to her motivation than she revealed. The thought lingered as I left the law office, checking my phone for messages. Nothing from Mark or Vanessa, but a text from Eleanor. Harold called. He's furious. What happened? I typed back quickly. Settlement meeting. Made counteroffers. We'll call you later. The rest of the day passed in a blur of work obligations and anxious waiting. I picked up the kids from school myself, Maya's, help ultimately unnecessary, and tried to focus on their chatter about the day's events rather than the negotiations hanging in the balance. It was nearly 6 o'clock when my phone rang. Patricia. They've accepted, she said without preamble. All of your terms, with one minor modification. Instead of a written apology, they're proposing a family meeting where both Mark and Harold will verbally acknowledge the past inequity and commit to change. I considered this. A face-to-face apology might actually be more meaningful than a written one that could be drafted by attorneys. That's acceptable, I agreed. When do we finalize? Tomorrow morning, my office 9 a.m. The trust documents are being drafted as we speak. After hanging up, I sat on the edge of my bed, a strange mixture of emotions washing over me. Relief that the financial battle was nearly won. Pride that I'd stood my ground. Lingering anger at the injustice my children had endured. And beneath it all, a quiet sadness for what should have been. A father who valued his children without being forced into it by legal threats. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from Vanessa. Heard they agreed to your terms. Thank you for not mentioning me. I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Had I just gained an ally in my ex-husband's new wife? Or was this part of some longer game I couldn't yet see? Thank you for the documents, I finally replied. They made a difference. Her response came quickly. I did it for the children, all of them. I set my phone aside, not entirely satisfied with her answer, but too exhausted to probe further. Tomorrow would bring the formal resolution of our financial dispute, but the emotional fallout would continue long after the papers were signed. The next morning, I dressed with particular care, selecting a navy blue dress that projected calm professionalism. The children sensed my nervous energy at breakfast. Are you going to see Dad again today? Zoe asked, pushing her cereal around. In the bowl. Yes, and Grandpa Harold too, I said carefully. We're working out some important things that will be good for our family. Like what? Tyler asked, his small face curious. I chose my words carefully. Like making sure we have enough money for the things you need and want. Like your dance classes, Zoe. And maybe those swimming lessons you've been asking about, Tyler. Both children perked up, exchanged glances. Really? Zoe asked, a note of cautious hope in her voice. Really, I confirmed. I can't promise everything will change overnight, but things are going to get better. After dropping them at school with extra tight hugs, I drove to Patricia's office, my hands steady on the wheel despite the flutter of nerves in my stomach. This was the culmination of weeks of struggle, of standing my ground against intimidation and manipulation. I should have felt triumphant, but mostly I felt weary. Battles rarely leave anyone truly unscathed. Patricia met me in the lobby, her expression guardedly optimistic. The trust documents arrived this morning. I've reviewed them. They appear to be in order. Equal amounts, equal terms to what's been established for Vanessa's children. I nodded, relief washing over me. And the support increase? All documented in the settlement agreement, along with provisions for extracurricular activities and medical expenses. She touched my arm lightly. This is a significant win, Rebecca. As we entered the conference room, I was surprised to see not just Mark, Harold, and Whitfield, but Vanessa as well. She sat slightly apart from the others, her expression neutral, hands folded neatly on the table. Harold's face was a mask of barely controlled anger, while Mark looked resigned. Neither met my eyes as I took my seat. Well, Whitfield began, forcing a veneer of professionalism over the awkward silence. We've prepared all the documents as discussed. The trusts have been established as of this morning. Here's the confirmation from the bank. He slid a folder across the table. Patricia examined its contents carefully before passing it to me. The numbers were substantial, enough to cover college and then some for both children, equal to what had been provided for Olivia and Jake, as promised. The support modification agreement is here, Whitfield continued, producing another document, reflecting the increased monthly amount and additional provisions we discussed. Patricia reviewed this as well, making a few notes before nodding her approval. And the confidentiality agreement? Whitfield produced a third document. All parties agree not to disclose the terms of this settlement or the circumstances leading to it. This includes Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, who will need to sign separately. I glanced at Patricia, who gave a subtle nod. Despite my instinctive dislike of secrecy, the confidentiality provision was a small price to pay for the substantial benefits to my children. Before we sign, I said, looking directly at Mark and Harold, there's the matter of the acknowledgement you agreed to make. Harold's jaw tightened, but Mark straightened in his chair, meeting my eyes for the first time. You're right, he said, his voice quieter than usual. Zoe and Tyler deserved better than what they've received from me since the divorce. I've prioritized my new family at their expense, and that wasn't fair to them. The admission clearly cost him, each word seeming to physically pain him. But it was Harold's turn now, and his resistance was palpable. I see no need for this theatrical display, he began stiffly. Harold? Vanessa interrupted, surprising everyone. You agreed to this. He shot her a look of pure venom before composing himself. Fine. I acknowledge that my financial support has been unevenly distributed among my grandchildren. That will be corrected going forward. It wasn't exactly heartfelt, but it was likely the best we'd get from a man as proud as Harold Thompson. I nodded my acceptance, and we proceeded to sign the various documents, the scratch of pens the only sound in the tense room. When the last signature was in place, Patricia gathered the papers. We'll have copies made for everyone. In the meantime, I believe we're concluded here. Harold stood immediately, buttoning his suit jacket with a sharp tug. Indeed, I trust this puts an end to any further unpleasantness. He directed this last word at me, his meaning clear. The battle was over, and he expected me to retreat gracefully. But I wasn't quite finished. One more thing, I said, remaining seated as the others began to rise. I'd like to schedule the family meeting we discussed, where you'll both speak directly to Zoe and Tyler. That won't be necessary, Harold said dismissively. The financial matters are resolved. It's not about the money, I replied evenly. It's about them hearing directly from you that they matter, that they're valued. That's part of our agreement. Mark looked uncomfortable but nodded. She's right, Dad. We agreed to this. He turned to me. We can do it this weekend, during my regular time with them. Thank you, I said simply. As the meeting disbanded, Vanessa lingered behind the others, waiting until Mark and Harold had left the room before approaching me. I'm glad it worked out, she said quietly. I studied her face, still not entirely certain of her motivations. Why did you help me? Really? She glanced toward the door to ensure we weren't overheard. When I married Mark, I thought I was getting a partner. Someone who would build a life with me, who valued family above all. A shadow crossed her face. Instead, I got a man who does whatever his father tells him to, who treats his own children as obligations rather than blessings. That's not the example I want for my kids. And now? I asked. Now that you've helped force this settlement? A small, sad smile touched her lips. Now I have some decisions to make about my own future, but that's not your concern. She extended her hand. I hope things improve for Zoe and Tyler from here on out. I shook her hand, surprised by the genuine warmth in the gesture. Thank you. I hope your children continue to thrive as well. As she turned to leave, a thought struck me. Vanessa? Did Mark know you were helping me? She paused at the door, her back to me. Not at first, but he does now. Did you tell him? She turned slightly, her profile silhouetted against the doorway. No, he found the emails I'd forwarded to myself, the ones I later gave to you. Understanding dawned. That's why he's not fighting this settlement. He knows you have copies of everything. She nodded once. Family secrets have a way of coming to light eventually. Harold never understood that. With that enigmatic statement, she left, her heels clicking down the hallway. Patricia returned, with copies of our signed agreements. Well, that's that. Barring any violations of the terms, your children will now receive the financial support they deserve. I accepted the folder she handed me, feeling strangely hollow. Yes, we'd won the battle. Zoe could return to her beloved dance classes. Tyler could take swimming lessons. Their education was secured. But the fact remained that it had taken legal action, threats, and leverage to force their father and grandfather to treat them fairly. It doesn't feel like much of a victory, I admitted. Patricia's expression softened. Financial settlements rarely do, but this will make a real difference in your children's lives, Rebecca. That's what matters. As I left the building, the morning sun bright against the glass towers of downtown, I couldn't help wondering what the true cost of this victory would be. Mark's resentment, Harold's enduring hostility, the knowledge my children would someday gain about how hard I'd had to fight for their basic needs. But then I thought of Zoe's face when I told her she might be able to return to dance. Tyler's excitement about swimming lessons, the relief of not having to choose between paying the mortgage and allowing them to participate in activities they loved. Some victories came with costs attached, but some costs were worth paying. My phone rang as I reached my car. Eleanor. I just heard from Harold, she said without greeting. He sounds defeated. What happened? We won, I said simply. Equal. Trusts for Zoe and Tyler. Increased support. Acknowledgement of past inequity. Her intake of breath was audible. Rebecca, I never thought Harold would agree to all that. He didn't have much choice, I replied, thinking of Vanessa's pivotal role. But they need your signature on the confidentiality agreement. Are you okay with that? Of course, she said immediately. Small price to pay for justice for my grandchildren. We chatted a bit longer, her relief palpable even through the phone. As we said goodbye, she added softly, I'm proud of you. Rebecca, it takes courage to stand up to powerful men who are used to getting their way. Her words stayed with me as I drove to pick up the children from school. Courage. Was that what I'd shown? It hadn't felt like courage most days. It had felt like desperation, like righteous anger, like the fierce protection any mother would show for her young. But perhaps that was courage after all, not the absence of fear, but the determination to fight despite it. The school playground came into view, children spilling out of the building in colorful streams. I spotted Zoe first, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, scanning the line of cars until she spotted mine. She nudged Tyler, pointing, and they made their way toward me, their backpacks bouncing with each step. As they climbed into the car, their voices overlapping with stories from their day, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The battle had been difficult, even ugly at times. The relationship with their father and grandfather would likely remain complicated. But in this moment, with their voices filling the car and their futures a little more secure, I knew it had been worth it. "Mom, can we get ice cream?" Tyler asked, buckling his seatbelt. Zoe rolled her eyes. "You always want ice cream." "Actually," I said, smiling at them in the rearview mirror, "I think ice cream is a great idea. We're celebrating today." "Celebrating what?" Zoe asked, her curious eyes meeting mine in the mirror. I thought about how to explain in terms they could understand. "We're celebrating that sometimes, when things aren't fair, you can stand up and help make them fair again." Tyler looked confused, but Zoe nodded slowly, a wisdom beyond her years in her expression. "Is that what you did, Mom? Made things fair again?" I nodded, throat suddenly tight with emotion. "I tried, sweetheart, and I think I succeeded." "Good," she said simply, reaching over to poke her brother playfully, "because Tyler really needs those swimming lessons. He's afraid of the deep end." "Am not," he protested. Their bickering filled the car as we drove toward the ice cream shop. Normal sibling squabbles that suddenly seemed precious to me. They were just children, navigating a world they hadn't created, deserving of all the support and opportunity their parents and grandparents could provide. And now, finally, they would get it. The day of the family meeting arrived with a strange sense of anticipation. I had spent the morning helping Zoe pick out an outfit. She had settled on a blue dress that brought out her eyes, while Tyler remained oblivious to the significance of the occasion, more concerned with whether he could bring his dinosaur toy to his father's house. "Just one dinosaur," I negotiated, helping him into his sneakers. "And remember, this is going to be a serious talk with Dad and Grandpa Harold." Tyler scrunched his nose. "Is Grandpa Harold still mad at us?" The innocent question caught me off guard. "Sweetheart, Grandpa Harold was never mad at you. The grown-ups had some disagreements, but that's all being fixed now." How do you explain to a 6-year-old that his grandfather had systematically devalued him in favor of step-grandchildren? You don't. Some truths are too heavy for small shoulders. Mark arrived precisely at noon, his BMW gleaming in the driveway. No Vanessa today. We had agreed this meeting should include only Mark, Harold, the children, and me. The kids rushed, out with their overnight bags while I locked the front door, taking a deep, steadying breath before turning to face my ex-husband. "They're excited," I said as a greeting. "Zoe's been talking about returning to dance class all week." Mark nodded, his expression uncharacteristically subdued. "Dad's meeting us at the house. He's making an effort." "That's all I ask?" I replied, keeping my voice neutral for the children's sake. The drive to Mark and Vanessa's home in Ridgewood Estates was mercifully brief. I sat in the passenger seat, the children chattering in the back, pointing out landmarks, and dogs being walked along the tree-lined streets. Mark remained mostly silent, responding to the kids' comments with distracted mm-hms and nods. "You seem nervous," I observed quietly. He shot me a quick glance. "This isn't easy for me." It wasn't easy for me to fight for our children's fair treatment either, I countered, keeping my voice low enough that Zoe and Tyler couldn't hear. "But sometimes we do difficult things because they're necessary." He sighed but didn't argue, a notable change from the defensive posture he'd maintained throughout our marriage and divorce. The house was exactly as Vanessa had described it, sprawling, modern with manicured landscaping and a circular driveway where Harold's silver Mercedes was already parked. The sight of it reinforced the stark contrast between Mark's new life and the modest home where his biological children spent most of their time. "Wow," Zoe murmured as we pulled up. "Dad's house is like a castle." I swallowed the bitter retort that rose to my lips. This wasn't the time to point out that the castle had been significantly funded by the same grandfather who had claimed he couldn't help with her dance classes. Inside, the house was immaculate, open concept with soaring ceilings, designer furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a backyard with a pool. Olivia and Jake were nowhere to be seen. Vanessa had taken them to her mother's for the day to ensure our meeting remained private. Harold stood in the living room, hands clasped behind his back, looking uncomfortable in casual clothes. I'd never seen him in anything but a suit before. He nodded stiffly as we entered. "Rebecca. Children." "Hi, Grandpa Harold." Tyler bounded forward, oblivious to the tension, dinosaur toy clutched in his small hand. "Want to see my T-Rex?" A flicker of genuine emotion crossed Harold's face. Surprise, perhaps, at the unconditional welcome from a grandchild he had so obviously slighted. Yes, I suppose so." As Tyler demonstrated his dinosaur's fearsome roar, Zoe hung back, her perceptive eyes taking in the luxurious surroundings. She had always been sensitive to undercurrents, to the things left unsaid between adults. "Let's sit down," Mark suggested, gesturing toward the expansive sectional sofa. "I've, prepared some snacks." On the coffee table sat a platter of cheese, crackers, and fruit, an attempt at hospitality that seemed out of character for Mark. Tyler immediately grabbed a handful of grapes, while Zoe sat primly on the edge of the sofa, hands folded in her lap. I took a seat beside her, offering silent support as Mark cleared his throat, obviously struggling with how to begin. "Zoe, Tyler," he started, his voice uncharacteristically tentative. "Your grandfather and I wanted to talk to you about some changes that are happening." Tyler looked up from his grapes. "Good changes or bad changes?" Mark glanced at Harold, who remained standing, his posture rigid. "Good changes," Mark assured them. "Very good changes." "Like what?" Zoe asked, her voice small but direct. Mark took a deep breath. "Like you being able to go back to dance class, Zoe, and Tyler starting swimming lessons and, well, a lot of other things that will help you both have all the opportunities you deserve." Zoe's eyes widened slightly. "Really? I can go back to Miss Andrea's class?" "Yes," I confirmed, smiling at her. "I've already called the studio. You can start next week if you want." Her face lit up, then clouded with confusion. "But I thought we couldn't afford it anymore." The innocent observation hung in the air, a stark reminder of the conversations we'd had about financial constraints, the careful explanations I'd given when she'd had to give up activities she loved. Mark shifted uncomfortably. That's part of what we need to talk about. You see, I should have." He faltered, looking to me for help. I shook my head slightly. This was his responsibility, his apology to make. I wouldn't script it for him. Harold stepped forward, his jaw set in determination. "What your father is trying to say is that mistakes were made, financial arrangements that weren't fair to you. Children." Tyler looked thoroughly confused now, dinosaur forgotten in his lap. "What's financial arrangements?" "It means money, buddy," Mark explained. "How we decide to spend money on important things." "Like dance class?" Zoe asked. "Like dance class," Mark confirmed. "And like the private school that Olivia and Jake go to." Zoe's brow furrowed. "They go to a fancy school. Mom said we couldn't afford fancy school." I watched Harold's face carefully as this simple statement laid bare the inequality that had existed. To his credit, he didn't flinch. "That's right," Harold said, his voice gruff but steady. "And that wasn't fair. I helped pay for their school but didn't help with your activities. That was wrong of me, and I apologize for that." The formal apology, delivered in Harold's characteristic stiff manner, nonetheless represented a seismic shift. "Harold," Thompson didn't apologize, not to anyone, and certainly not to children. Yet here he was, acknowledging his mistake to his young grandchildren. Zoe and Tyler exchanged confused glances, clearly uncertain how to respond to this unusual situation. "It's okay, Grandpa," Tyler finally said, with the easy forgiveness of childhood. "Everybody makes mistakes sometimes." The simple absolution seemed to affect Harold more than any adult argument could have. He turned away briefly, and I could have sworn I saw him blink rapidly before composing himself. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees to bring himself to eye level with the children. "There's more. Grandpa Harold has set up special accounts for both of you for college and other important things when you're older, just like Olivia and Jake have." "College? Like where you learn to be a grown-up?" Tyler asked. Mark smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him today. "That's right, buddy. And it costs a lot of money, but you don't have to worry about that now because it's all taken care of." "And," I added, wanting the children to understand the full scope of the changes, "Dad is going to help more with all the things you need and want to do. Sports, classes, summer camps, all those things we've had to say no to sometimes." Zoe's face remained serious, processing this information. "Why now?" she asked suddenly. "Why didn't Dad help before?" The directness of the question silenced the room. Mark's face flushed, and Harold shifted uncomfortably. This was the crux of it all, the question with no satisfactory answer. "I made mistakes, Zoe," Mark finally said, his voice rough with emotion I hadn't expected. "I wasn't thinking clearly about what was most important. I got distracted by new things, new people in my life, and I didn't pay enough attention to what you and Tyler needed. That was wrong of me." It wasn't a complete explanation. How could it be? But it was perhaps the most honest thing Mark had said to his children since the divorce. Zoe studied her father's face for a long moment, her 9-year-old eyes somehow ancient in their assessment. "Okay," she said finally, neither fully accepting nor rejecting his explanation. "Can I really start dance next week?" The practical question, so characteristic of Zoe's resilient nature, broke the tension. "Yes, absolutely," I confirmed. "I'll take you to buy new dance shoes tomorrow." The rest of the afternoon unfolded with a strange new dynamic. Harold, initially stiff and formal, gradually relaxed as Tyler drew him into a game involving dinosaurs and building blocks. Mark moved between awkward attempts at meaningful conversation with Zoe and practical discussions with me about schedules and activities the children might want to pursue. By the time I prepared to leave, the children staying for their regular weekend with Mark, something had shifted, not healed exactly, but changed. The ice had cracked, revealing possibilities beneath. "I'll pick them up Sunday at 6, I said at the door, gathering my purse. Mark nodded. I was thinking, maybe we could start fresh with the custody schedule too. Be more flexible. Maybe I could take them for dinner one night during the week, give you an evening to yourself occasionally. The offer surprised me. It was the first time since the Eith's divorce he'd suggested more time with the children that wasn't motivated by reducing his financial obligations. That would be nice, I said cautiously. For them and for me. Zoe and Tyler hugged me goodbye, Tyler already lobbying to use the pool later, Zoe whispering a quiet thank you in my ear that brought tears to my eyes. As I drove home to an empty house, I felt lighter than I had in months. The settlement wasn't perfect. Money couldn't erase the hurt of neglect or the damage of favoritism, but it represented a new beginning, a chance for my children to move forward with the security and opportunities they deserved. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. Maya. Well, how did it go? She demanded without preamble. Better than expected, I admitted, letting myself into the quiet house. Harold actually apologized. Mark seemed genuinely regretful. Wow, Maya breathed. Never thought I'd see the day. So what happens now? I kicked off my shoes and sank onto the couch. Now we implement the agreement. Zoe starts dance next week. Tyler begins swimming lessons. Life goes on, just with more financial breathing room. And emotionally? Maya pressed. How are you feeling about all this? The question gave me pause. In the whirlwind of legal battles and negotiations, I'd hardly had time to process my own feelings. Vindicated, I said finally. Relieved. Still angry sometimes, when I think about how hard I had to fight for what should have been automatic. But mostly, hopeful. Hopeful that this is a turning point for everyone. Even for Mark? I sighed. Maybe especially for Mark. I think this whole ordeal forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself, about the kind of father he's been. And Vanessa? Any updates there? Nothing since the settlement meeting, I admitted. But something tells me her marriage has hit some rocky ground. She essentially betrayed Mark to help my children. Complicated, Maya murmured. Well, I'm proud of you, Beck. You stood your ground when most people would have given up. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet house, thinking about the journey of the past months. From devastation to determination, from victim to advocate. I had discovered strengths I hadn't known I possessed, and a courage I'd never had to test before. My phone pinged with a text message from Zoe. Dad's taking us for ice cream and then to buy swimsuits for the pool. Love you, Mom. I smiled, typing back, have fun, love you both, before setting my phone aside. The simple normalcy of the message, a father taking his children for treats and shopping, shouldn't have felt remarkable. That it did was a reminder of how far we'd come and how far we still had to go. The weekend passed quietly. I took advantage of the child-free time to catch up on work, have dinner with Maya, and even indulge in a massage, a luxury I hadn't been able to afford in months. By Sunday evening, I was refreshed and eager to see the children again. Mark's BMW pulled into my driveway precisely at 6. The children tumbled out, sunburned and smiling, full of stories about swimming and movies and a visit to the park with Harold, who had apparently spent most of Saturday with them, another unprecedented development. Grandpa taught me to play chess, Zoe announced as she dragged her backpack inside. He says I'm a natural. And we went to this really cool dinosaur museum, Tyler added, bouncing with excitement. Grandpa bought me a fossil. I raised an eyebrow at Mark, who stood awkwardly in the doorway. Sounds like Harold made quite an effort. Mark nodded. He did, I think. I think he's actually enjoying getting to know them. Really know them, not just see them at obligatory holiday gatherings. That's good, I said simply, unwilling to comment further on Harold's apparent change of heart. Actions would speak louder than one weekend of attentiveness. There's something else, Mark said, lowering his voice as the children disappeared into their rooms to unpack. Vanessa and we're going to try counseling. The admission caught me off guard. Oh? He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from our marriage as a sign of genuine distress. Things have been difficult since she helped you with those emails. But it's forced us to have some honest conversations about our relationship, about the role my father plays in our lives. I wasn't sure what response he expected from me. Sympathy, advice. Neither seemed appropriate given our history. I hope it helps, I said finally, opting for neutral support. He nodded, glancing toward the children's rooms. They're great kids, Rebecca. I don't want to miss any more of their lives than I already have. The simple acknowledgement, so long in coming, brought an unexpected lump to my throat. They are great kids, and they need their father. Their real father, not just weekend ice cream and occasional appearances. I know, he said quietly. I'm trying to figure out how to be that for them. And for Olivia and Jake, too. All four of them deserve better than what I've been. There was a raw honesty in his voice I hadn't heard in years. Whether it would translate to lasting change remained to be seen, but it was a start. After he left, I helped the children settle back into home routines, unpacking, baths, laying out clothes for school the next day. As I tucked Tyler into bed, he asked a question that caught me by surprise. "Mom, are you and Dad friends now?" I considered how to answer in terms he could understand. "We're working on being good partners and taking care of you and Zoe. That's the most important thing." "But you're not mad at each other anymore?" I smoothed his cowlick, buying time to formulate my response. "We're finding better ways to talk to each other and solve problems. And we both love you very, very much." He seemed satisfied with this answer, snuggling deeper under his dinosaur-patterned comforter. "Good. I don't like it when everybody's mad." "Me neither, buddy," I whispered, kissing his forehead. "Sweet dreams." Zoe was still awake when I entered her room, sitting up in bed with a book. She set it aside as I sat on the edge of her mattress. "Dad seems different," she observed, her perceptive eyes studying my face for confirmation. "How so?" She shrugged one shoulder. "Less busy, more listening. He asked me lots of questions about school and friends and stuff, and he didn't look at his phone the whole time we were talking." The simple observation spoke volumes about Mark's typical behavior during his parenting time. "That's good, sweetheart. I think Dad is trying to be more present with you and Tyler." She nodded thoughtfully. "Grandpa Harold, too. He never used to want to play games or anything before. But he played chess with me for like 2 hours. People can change," I said carefully. "Especially when they realize they've been missing out on something important." Zoe was quiet for a moment, picking at a loose thread on her blanket. "Mom, did you make them change? With the meetings and the lawyer and stuff?" The question was astute, reflecting her growing understanding of the adult dynamics at play. I considered how to answer honestly without burdening her with complexities beyond her years. "I helped them see some things more clearly," I said finally. "Sometimes adults need reminders about what really matters." She seemed to accept this, leaning forward to hug me tightly. "I'm glad you did, and I'm really excited about dance class." "Me too, sweetheart. Now get some sleep. Big day tomorrow." As I closed her door, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its bumps. Trust, once broken, took time to rebuild. But for the first time since Mark had walked out, I felt genuine hope for my children's relationship with their father and grandfather. True to his word, Mark enrolled Tyler in swimming lessons that week. I registered Zoe for dance classes, my heart swelling as I watched her twirl in her new leotard, face alight with joy at returning to the activity she loved. The financial relief was immediate and substantial. No more choosing between dance, lessons, and new school shoes. No more late-night calculations to determine if we could afford both the electric bill and a birthday party. The following weekend brought another surprise. Eleanor called, her voice bright with excitement. "Rebecca, I've had the most interesting conversation with Harold." "Oh?" I shifted the phone to my other ear as I folded laundry. "About what?" "About the lake house. He wants to invite you and the children to use it for a week this summer. Without Mark or anyone else, just a vacation for the three of you." I nearly dropped the phone. The Thompson Lake House was a family treasure, a sprawling property on a pristine northern lake where generations had vacationed. During our marriage, Mark and I had taken the children there several times, but since the divorce, I had assumed that privilege was revoked. "That's unexpected," I managed. Eleanor laughed softly. "You've made quite an impression, dear. Harold would never admit it, but I think he respects you now. Standing up to him isn't something many people do successfully." "It wasn't about winning against Harold," I protested. "It was about fairness for the children." I know that, she assured me. And deep down, so does he. This is his way of acknowledging it without having to say the words. After we hung up, I sat among the half-folded laundry, contemplating how much had changed in such a short time. From fighting for basic child support to being offered the lake house, from begging for help with dance class fees to having college funds established, the transformation was remarkable. But the most significant changes weren't financial. They were in the subtle shifts in relationships, the reopening of doors I had thought permanently closed. Mark calling midweek just to chat with the children. Harold sending chess books for Zoe and dinosaur models for Tyler. Vanessa texting occasionally with genuine questions about the children's preferences and interests as she planned activities for their blended weekends. 3 months after the settlement, I received another unexpected call from Vanessa. "Rebecca, do you have a minute?" "Of course," I replied, curious about the reason for her call. We had established a cordial co-parenting relationship, but personal calls were rare. "I wanted to let you know. Mark and I have decided to move to a smaller house in a different neighborhood." The news surprised me. "Oh, is everything okay?" She sighed softly. "Yes and no. The counseling has been helpful, but we've realized we need to establish some healthier boundaries with Harold. Living in the house he helped pay for makes that difficult." I understood immediately. The golden handcuffs of Harold's financial support came with strings that were particularly visible in the showcase home he had helped them acquire. "That sounds like a positive step," I said carefully. "It is," she agreed. "And I wanted to ask your thoughts on schools. We're considering moving the kids to public school next year, all 4 of them, creating more equality in how they're raised." The significance of this shift wasn't lost on me. Moving all the children to public school would eliminate one of the most visible inequalities in how Mark's biological and stepchildren were treated. "I think that could be very positive for all the children," I said sincerely, "especially if it's part of creating a more unified family culture." "That's the goal," Vanessa confirmed. "Mark is finally standing up to Harold about some things. It's not easy, but it's necessary." After we hung up, I thought about the journey all of us had been on. When Mark had first left, I had seen Vanessa as the villain, the home wrecker, who had stolen my husband and disrupted my children's lives. The reality, as always, was more complex. She had her own struggles, her own journey as a mother, trying to navigate the complicated dynamics of a blended family dominated by Harold's influence. That night, I wrote in the journal I had started keeping since the divorce, a record of our family's evolution and my own growth. Looking back at entries from the height of the legal battle, I could trace the transformation from bewildered victim to empowered advocate. The anger that had once fueled me had gradually given way to something more sustainable: determination, purpose, and eventually, a measure of peace. 6 months after the settlement, life had found a new rhythm. The children spent Wednesday evenings and alternate weekends with Mark and Vanessa in their new, more modest home. They attended their activities without the constant financial stress that had once shadowed every decision. They spoke of their father with genuine affection rather than the careful neutrality they had adopted during the worst of the conflict. And me? I had reclaimed parts of myself that had been submerged during the marriage and early divorce. My confidence, my voice, my ability to stand firm in the face of intimidation. The freelance business that had once been a desperate attempt to supplement. Child support had grown into a successful enterprise, allowing me to work flexible hours and be present for my children. One evening, as I sat on the back porch watching Zoe and Tyler play in the yard, Maya joined me with glasses of wine. "You seem happy," she observed, studying my face. "Genuinely happy, not just putting on a brave face, happy." I smiled, acknowledging the truth in her observation. "I am. Not because everything is perfect, it isn't, but because I know now that I can handle whatever comes." You fought for your kids and won, Maya said, raising her glass in a toast. Not many people would have had the courage to go up against someone like Harold Thompson. I clinked my glass against hers. I didn't feel courageous most of the time. I felt terrified, angry, desperate. But I knew I had to keep going. That's what courage is, she pointed out, doing the scary thing anyway. As the sun set over our small backyard, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I watched my children chase fireflies across the grass. Their laughter floated on the evening air, uninhibited and joyful. Whatever complications remained in our family dynamics, and there were many, my children were thriving. They knew they were valued, not just by me, but increasingly by their father and grandfather as well. The battle for financial equity had revealed deeper truths and catalyzed changes I couldn't have anticipated. Mark was slowly becoming the father his children deserved. Harold was discovering the rewards of genuine relationships with his grandchildren. And I had found a strength within myself that no one, not even me, had fully recognized before. Some victories come at great cost. Some battles leave no true winners. But this fight, this standing up for what my children deserved, had ultimately benefited everyone involved. The road ahead would have its challenges, certainly. Blended families always do. But we were all moving forward with greater awareness, honesty, and commitment to the children who deserved nothing less than our best selves. As Zoe and Tyler raced back to the porch, faces flushed with exertion and happiness, I opened my arms to them. Whatever the future held, we would face it together, stronger for having weathered the storm, wiser for having learned its lessons, and more appreciative of the calm that followed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.